Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Juan Davalos, and we are back with another break on our regularly scheduled show of giving you some online courses because we recently had Sean McMeekin come to campus. You may know Sean McMeekin is one of the professors in our course Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. It is a recent documentary course that features several of our professors here at the college, and Sean McMeekin was one of them. But we also wanted to talk to him about his new book, To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. So now we're going to go ahead and turn to Jeremiah and Dr. McMeekin as they discuss communism in his new book.
Hello, I'm Jeremiah Regan, Executive Director of Hillsdale College Online Courses. I'm joined by Sean McMeekin, the Francis Flournoy Professor of European History at Bard College. Sean McMeekin is the award-winning author of several books, including Stalin's War, A New History of World War II, The Russian Revolution, A New History, July 1914, and The Ottoman Endgame, War, Revolution, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, 1908 to 1923. And most recently of To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. Professor McMeekin is also featured in Hillsdale College Online Courses' new documentary course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. Sean, it's a delight to have you back with us here at Hillsdale. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me back, Jeremiah. It's always great to be here.
Lovely to hear. We like to do these live streams to give our students and our subscribers a chance to dig further into the concepts that we have covered in the course, to give you a chance to expound on the ideas you talk about, and to let you talk about your new book. So we're really pleased to have you here today. And I'm going to start you with a softball, very simple, easy question. Contrasting the American founding, which in the Declaration of Independence espouses some universal ideas, all men being created equal, having equal natural rights, and yet the Americans at the time of the founding believed that the form of government that a people determines is best for securing those rights is a decision left to those people, their particular habits, customs. I'm thinking of Federalist II and other examples where the Americans say certain characteristics suit certain forms of government to a certain people. The communists don't have those same beliefs. And so my question is, does the legitimacy of communism require that all nations adapt its principles and implement its forms? Does it require universalism to justify its existence?
Well, thanks. That's a great question, Jeremiah. I'm not sure I'd characterize it as a softball. It's a really interesting way of looking at the problem because the very premise of communism, as opposed to different strains and socialist or even anarchist thought, is that it is supposed to be universal in some sense. That is to say, it's internationalist. When the Marxists would have these debates, along with other socialists who weren't all necessarily followers of Marx, about how best to organize for, plan for, direct the inevitable, as they saw it, revolution. They argued about these problems. And the idea that Marx and his followers eventually tried to put in place as a kind of orthodoxy is that Marxism had to be internationalist. The class war had to be universal, that workers everywhere had brothers in other countries, whereas their, let's say, non-workers or non-proletarians in their own countries were not their brothers. So that they would organize these internationals, as they called them. The first was under Marx. The second one began in 1889 on the 100-year anniversary of the French Revolution. The third and most famous one was the one that Lenin organized after the Russian Revolution in 1919. And the idea was, in fact, to coordinate everything internationally with uniform doctrine and uniform principles. In practice, this never worked out very well. Even May Day, the most lasting creation of the Second International, for example, was not marked in the same way in every country. There were dramatic differences between the way, let's say, Germans might do it. They tended to work and then maybe get together and sing songs afterwards. In many countries, the workers would not go to work. Of course, they'd take the day off. Sometimes you'd have marches. Sometimes they might be more careful about marching because they were afraid of inciting police scrutiny and possibly a crackdown. And then even under Lenin's Communist International, sometimes called the Third International, while they did try to make doctrine uniform from country to country, inevitably they had to make certain compromises. And more to the point, there was an implicit recognition that despite The theory being that eventually the communist revolution would become universal and would engulf the entire earth. For the time being, there was only one communist country, and that was Russia, or later the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and that in fact, communists, while working for revolution in their own lands, must keep their primary loyalty to the Soviet Union and its foreign policy needs. So there was an implicit acceptance that despite these principles being universal in theory, in practice, one had to make compromises and prioritize the needs of the first worker state, that is to say, the USSR.
Did the Soviets feel or perceive a burden as those who had begun the revolution, who had their eyes open, to coax or drag along the rest of the world to encourage revolutionaries in other countries?
They absolutely had this pretension, and in fact, they enshrined this in the conditions for membership in the Communist International. These were formulated and then adopted by communist parties in 1920 after the Second Comintern Congress. Some of the conditions were slightly ephemeral, relating to even certain individual names of the time that are now forgotten, but some of them were meant to be enduring. That is to say, the way in which you were supposed to organize and create shadow governments and plot to overthrow the governments all over the world. But in the end, all of them had to obey orders of a central authority in Moscow. This was called the Executive Committee of the Communist International, or ECCI. Largely forgotten today, it was effectively the world headquarters of the Communist Revolution. Almost invariably, its leading lights or its leaders would be members of the Russian Communist Party, although there were trusted members from other countries in Europe who would prove their bona fides, perhaps in action, perhaps by way of their writings, who were also then trusted members who might be dispatched as emissaries to other countries in order to spread the word and help to inform them of the latest doctrine, the line of the day, how were they supposed to proceed, how they were supposed to act. In practice, obviously, perfect obedience was impossible, but in fact, they were supposed to obey, and this was made quite explicit. Moscow held the purse strings, Moscow had the prestige, and so ultimately communist parties around the world were supposed to call themselves the section or the communist section of such and such country, obeying orders from the international headquarters in Moscow.
And to extend the comparison or the contrast between the American idea and the Soviet idea, statesmen such as John Quincy Adams would, in speeches and in diplomatic interactions, say, America is the well-wisher of liberty everywhere, but the champion only of her own, implying that America was not going to intercede or even offer support, much less exert control over any nation that was attempting to emulate the American model. Would the Soviets, as part of the loyalty and adherence to their principles seen in other countries, require a certain form of government? Could a new Soviet, an emerging Soviet or communist regime play around with the way that their political structure worked, or were they following the model of Moscow?
In theory, they were supposed to follow the model of Moscow. And in some ways, this was easier to enforce when the Soviets were the only communist country. Because after all, anything they did was almost by definition right and good, and the other countries were supposed to lead or follow their example. Once there were other communist countries, it became a bit more complicated because in theory, they were still supposed to coordinate everything with Moscow. The Communist International itself was actually dissolved in 1943, in part for diplomatic reasons. This is when the Soviets were allied with Britain and the United States against Nazi Germany. Soviets, of course, were not fighting Japan, but that's another subject. But they did this in part as a sort of a diplomatic sop, or almost a gesture in the direction of President Roosevelt and the United States. Also, it was seen as counterproductive. The contradiction in the principle of this constant intervention in the affairs of other countries was every so often it might have been in the Soviet interest to let those countries function normally. When the United States, for example, along with Britain, was sending vast amounts of stores, war materiel, foodstuffs, weapons, industrial inputs, raw goods to the Soviet Union during the war, what we usually subsume under the heading of Lend-Lease, it was in the interest of the Soviets to let that government function normally. So in a sense, they were suspending their normal modus operandi, which was to constantly attempt to overthrow all world governments. So that was basically the principle of the Comintern. It was constantly to plot. Now, this might not mean every single day was active military resistance. It meant you were constantly plotting the revolution. You were constantly plotting at some point to ultimately overthrow the governments of the world. So the Soviets were certainly capable of being pragmatic. So they did disband the Communist International. They brought it back for Europe, at least, in a different form, what we usually call the common form. So this was in the Cold War years. And there was precise coordination, eventually a military alliance as well, known as the Warsaw Pact. China was a bit of a wild card, in part because it didn't belong to the exact same security apparatus, and coordination with the Chinese was never perfect, and later on there was even a pretty dramatic split between Beijing and Moscow. We call the Sino-Soviet split. So in the end, the Soviets were forced, perhaps almost against their will, to accept some level of, perhaps plurality is not the right word. In this case, it's more one large enough power, that being China, was able to function semi-independently from Moscow. But this would cause friction in places such as Vietnam, where both the Chinese and the Soviets were supporting the communist government of North Vietnam, but had slightly different priorities. In theory, if you go all the way back to the founding of the Communist International, there was supposed to be this kind of perfect coordination. But of course, reality always struck, and the Soviets did have to make compromises from time to time with reality as it arose on the ground.
There's a common trope that true communism has never been tried. Is there any validity to that trope, or has communism been tried and proved wanting?
Well, I suppose one could always say that if true communism meant, by definition, the elimination of all private property and all private transactions and all private commerce and the suppression of the black market to an extreme degree, such that absolutely every member of, I suppose in the first case, the Soviet Union, and eventually everyone on planet Earth, would all somehow acquire their needs for daily sustenance from some centralized storage facility, which was overseen by these neutral bureaucrats who supposedly had no greater privileges than anyone else. It's hard to imagine how that would actually function. Essentially, this would lead to not just economic collapse, but massive starvation. Now, the perfect form may never have been achieved, but there were certainly efforts to put it into practice. The extreme version of war communism, as they later called it, to discredit it to some extent, or say this maybe wasn't the real version. So this was practiced in Russia between about 1918 and 1921, when they had to give up on it and allow certain types of private trading and the grain trade and private retail and so on to come back, simply because otherwise you had massive starvation everywhere. There was a huge famine, among other problems that had resulted, industrial collapse, utter economic devastation. Under Stalin, oddly enough, despite the reputation of Stalin as being to some extent the most extreme or the most violent or the most aggressive with these 5-year plans and massive attempts to arm and so on, under Stalin, oddly enough, they actually did not go quite as far. Under war communism, they actually tried to abolish money. It turned out not to be practicable. And so under Stalin, they actually never did that. They accepted that they did have to use money for transactions, that they had to pay certain salaries and wages, and in fact, amazingly, they didn't pay the same wages to everyone. So there was even a kind of a failure to even pay lip service to the idea of equality. They would pay managers much more than engineers, who were paid much more than workers. There were later efforts in China, perhaps under the Great Leap Forward, the most extreme example, where they did try to nationalize agriculture. And some of this went right back to Marx's Manifesto of the Communist Party. He spoke of industrial armies in the countryside. He spoke of the idea of the state mobilizing labor, effectively slave labor, to perform all of the essential tasks of the economy. They tried. Perhaps they never got quite as close as they wanted to fully nationalizing every single aspect of life, after all, in a country of hundreds of millions of people. Cambodia perhaps got the closest to some abstract ideal where they had snuffed out human freedom entirely and everyone had just become these kind of slave workers of a state. But of course, as some of Marx's earliest critics had noticed, it was impossible to have a state of perfect equality, because in the end, someone had to run the state, and those people running the state, even if they may have been former workers or proletarians, would cease to be proletarians as soon as they became managers and bosses and bureaucrats and politicians. So in a certain literal sense, I think you could say that true communism has never been achieved, but I would disagree that it's never been tried. I think it has multiple times.
Human nature and the realities of politics continually reassert themselves.
That's right.
You make an interesting point in our documentary course, which students can check out at hillsdale.edu/Marxism, about the Great Leap Forward. You quote, and I don't remember the name of the individual, as saying, "We took a great leap forward and we broke our legs."
I believe it was "We broke our bones."
Broke our bones.
Yes, the same quote.
Which makes us wonder about the status of China today. And there was general agreement, but some disagreement on the particulars between our scholars in the course as to whether China is a communist society today. How did China recover itself after breaking their bones following the Great Leap Forward? Are they more communist now, less communist? Are they communist at all? What is the status of China today?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I mean, even after they broke their bones in the Great Leap Forward, there was still the turmoil of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which spun on for several years and was never really finally disowned until almost the time when Mao finally died, about 10 years after it was launched in 1966. I mean, there were echoes of it already in 1965. But so China didn't recover right away. In many ways, she really didn't start to recover until the reforms under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, when at least certain experiments in a more private or a freer economy, or at the very least certain concessions in these kind of special enterprise zones were allowed and permitted. Western direct investment was allowed and permitted. A lot of it, of course, functioned via industrial espionage. There were a lot of ties to both firms and companies in Japan and eventually in the United States, a lot of technology transfer, a lot of spying, a lot of kind of stealing of industrial secrets and patents, and eventually China did adopt this hybrid model. At the time, curiously enough, they did not claim that they were adopting capitalism or state capitalism. In fact, a hot book in China in the early 80s among the party bureaucrats was, believe it or not, a biography by the late Princeton professor Stephen Cohen of the early Soviet theorist, bureaucrat, planning economist Bukharin. So Bukharin, who briefly had a moment in the mid-20s under the so-called new economic policy when the Soviets had begun to permit certain levels of private enterprise and private trading, again, just to get out of famine and to allow the economy to recover a little bit from the depths to which it had sunk. So Bukharin became, for a time, the poster child, as we might say today, of this new economic policy, the idea of a reformed communism, which did accept some role for limited-scale private enterprise while still under the all-seeing eye of the state, of the bureaucracy of the party. Lenin, for example, had said that we would allow this, but the commanding heights of the economy, foreign trade, heavy industry, war industry, anything that had to do with the military, as we call it today, military-industrial complex, would still be state-controlled and state-overseen. But certain less important sectors of the economy, perhaps elements of the consumer sector or even small-scale agriculture, this could be allowed to develop in a less overtly state-directed way. So they did begin experimenting in the 1980s, and these experiments eventually led to this hybrid model of some variety of semi-communism or state capitalism. The element that I think remains, and your question about whether it's more or less communist is an interesting one. I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that question. I think in the sense of the state control of society, that is to say, the role of the state in surveilling the people, in controlling communications, in controlling the movements, and even to some extent the access of the people to things like schools and jobs. I don't think the state has lifted up as much of the control as it did over certain sectors of the economy. So that there's an element in which, and again, this is something I touch on in the book, perhaps more than we did in the online course, there's an element in which communism has evolved in China in this direction now, where the state is performing in some ways a more efficient function. That is to say, sure, there are still plans and there are still distortions in the economy, and perhaps they're building ghost cities that have been planned without tenants and customers. There's still elements of state planning. There's still elements of the old statist economics that we usually understand by way of communism. Some people object that because there are semi-private or private enterprises, and of course Western capitalist firms operating in China, this means that they've abandoned communism. But the fact is this was always true, not just in China, but even the Soviet Union. Even in the time of Lenin, the time really at the height of Stalin's 5-year plans, there were many private firms that operated in Russia, again, usually under the guidance of the state or with concessions from the state. Many Western firms were involved in helping to design and plan Stalin's factories, everything from smelting aluminum to producing trucks, tanks, melting steel. All of these things were actually designed, or not all of them, but most of them were designed or kind of put into place by U.S. firms, U.S. engineers, with many U.S. managers. So there was always a role for Western capitalists to play, even in the planned communist economy. So it's a very difficult question to answer. I think we could simply take the Chinese Communist Party at its word. This is another way of answering the question, that whatever it is that they are doing in China is still communism, because after all, they call it communism.
They're claiming to be communists.
That's
we
right.
should give them the benefit of the doubt.
Perhaps we should.
The sophistication of the Chinese social controls, the surveillance state, the videos we can see of drones flying around apartment buildings and monitoring people, the social credit system, are these, and this is of course, I'm asking for speculation which might not be quite fair, but what would Marx think of these type of societal controls? Because on one hand there's a misperception that Marx is indicating that people will unite and voluntarily form a communist. There'll be a popular uprising in favor of communism. On the other hand, Marx will talk about the need to communism to assert itself through aggression. Where do you think he would fall in this idea of the society still, after decades, having to control its people, meaning the people are not true communists yet?
Well, I think Marx, like many of his followers, saw or believed that after the revolution, eventually class would dissolve and disappear. But again, this was the theory. Until that happened, until that true communism in some longed-for, hoped-for future occurred, he did think that ruthless cleansing political violence was necessary, because there would always be these class enemies, remnants of the old either feudal or bourgeois or capitalist or monarchist elites, depending on the country, depending on its stage of development. There would always be these class enemies who would have to be dealt with. And even in his lifetime, when maybe the nearest approximation of communism occurred in the form of the Paris Commune in 1871, it certainly wasn't perfect communism. In fact, many aspects of it weren't what we might call communist. They didn't nationalize property or abolish the private property. They didn't even pretend to do so. But there were certain other measures that were on the side of greater state control, of greater social control and surveillance, and they certainly did deal with what they considered to be social or class enemies. They adopted the red flag, certain elements of what we might call the socialist or communist tradition, and Marx embraced them. And in fact, even when it went down in this blaze of violence as the French army fought their way into the city in the Communards, set fire to the Tuileries and the Hôtel de Ville, many other buildings, and they actually sent women into battle against the regular army, and there were these horrendous casualties and all this bloodshed that was later almost exorcised by Parisians when they built the famous Church of the Sacred Heart, the Sacré-Cœur, up in Montmartre. All of this violence Marx embraced and celebrated and endorsed. And he didn't do so subtly, he did so quite openly, saying this was all entirely necessary in order to advance the revolution forward. So I don't know what he might have thought specifically about, let's say, surveillance drones. But if they were performing a role in the class war, in helping to do away with or unmask class enemies in order to move the revolution forward, I think in some sense Marx would have approved. Certainly many Soviet leaders would have approved. I mean, they tried their own version of this. They didn't have drones yet, let's say, in the 1960s and 70s under Brezhnev, but they did have these tiny pin-sized bugging devices that they used to listen in on private conversations, to try to invade people's space and learn what they were thinking or saying. They certainly tried the same level of social control to enforce compliance, social obedience, with a rather extreme version of what we now call a social credit system, with obviously the indoctrination of the young, people joining things like the Pioneers and the Komsomol, later, of course, the party. They accept that perhaps not everyone would be party members, but if you weren't, then you were almost inherently suspect. And so they have to make sure. They would force you to show up to meetings. You would have to vote. They would notice if you were absent. All of these ways in which you maintained your good standing with the state. They didn't call it a social credit system then. In some ways, it was perhaps more elaborate. It was certainly more expensive and extensive in many ways. It required more effort on the part of the government. What's so striking, I think, about the more recent efforts at imposing this social control or social credit system is how much easier it has been made by new technologies. And the fact that so many people, of course, will voluntarily wire themselves up by sharing their innermost thoughts with social media companies or perhaps even with their listening devices in their home. Whether you're talking about the Alexa or other listening devices that now will actually listen to our private thoughts and share them out with various brokers who are buying up information about our interests, our needs. Perhaps in the US it's mostly the interests of consumers and capitalist advertising, but can very easily, of course, be turned against us in the same way that it is currently being done in China.
Interesting that you mentioned that, because for some reason, and Facebook says it was a mistake, our Facebook page, the Hillsdale College Online Courses Facebook page, was taken down the day before our course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism, debuted. We can only speculate as to why. They won't tell us, and they said it was a mistake. But it's interesting what these corporations, just like governments, can do. Plato had an answer for how you could institute communism in the Republic, and scholars debate whether he was offering this as a prescription or if he was trying to raise it as a caution, but he said, you need to take everyone over the age of 10 out of the city. Doesn't say how you do that, one can wonder, but the point being, all of the habits and the customs of the old society would need to go away in order to implement communism. You need to train the children, ages 10 and younger, in the new principles, the new regime, and that's the only way you could have a communist society take root. You have to extinguish the old. Has that been tried?
Different versions of this have certainly been tried by communist regimes. Some of the orphanages in particular were quite notorious in places like Romania. And in fact, some of this goes back to the French Revolution. So many people were guillotined and, of course, lost their parents and then were adopted by the state. And there was even this idea that perhaps the state would better look after the, well, not the interests necessarily, but the minds of the children. And of course, we always hear echoes of this today, that maybe we shouldn't necessarily trust parents, that in fact, even in the United States, people talk about this, the importance of the schools and shaping the children and whether or not the parents should have a role. The communist governments, for the most part, if there's a balance between, let's say, the private sphere and the parents and the home and the state institutions, definitely fell down on the side of the state playing an all-pervasive role both in education and even in the case of these state orphanages, literally raising the children. There was an even more extreme version of this in China's great proletarian cultural revolution, and then, of course, most notoriously perhaps with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where the state would literally arm children as these kind of class warriors, oftentimes even pre-teens. Children as young as perhaps 12 or 13 or even younger in some cases were actually armed by the state and encouraged to go around and effectively terrorize teachers, professors, suspect adults, class enemies, in some cases even their parents. Perhaps the most notorious Soviet example is the cult. It was made out of Pavlik Morozov, someone who turned in his own father. And this is in the course of the collectivization period in Ukraine, we now call the Holodomor, terror, hunger, famine. The idea that a child was serving the higher interest of communism, of the state, by turning in their family members if they were somehow class enemies, or perhaps if they were hoarding grain or committing some other crime against the state. Now, it's never that they achieved a perfect version of this, where they were able to, shall we say, indoctrinate all of the children in some centralized state school or orphanage. But there are always degrees of this, I think, in communist countries, because in general the idea was, of course, that if you are going to build this very well-organized future society, that you could not trust people over a certain age, particularly those who had been, let's say, alive before the revolution. They didn't know all of the new holidays. They didn't know all of the new rules. They still had some of the old habits ingrained. In China, under the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, it was quite explicit. They talked about the four olds and how they all had to be destroyed, and all old culture and old habits all had to be destroyed. So at times they were quite explicit about this. At other times it was more subtle. But yes, usually you would have some idea that the state was supposed to take the children away, maybe not 24 hours of the day, but it was supposed to take them out of the influence of their parents so that they would learn the true way, the new way, so that you would have some variety of these youth organizations with uniforms. Of course, one could make a comparison and say that, well, in the US we had the Boy and the Girl Scouts, but the difference, of course, was that while there might have been a vision of the things they were supposed to learn and how they were supposed to live a good life, there wasn't necessarily a state ideology involved, whereas there was with the pioneers and the Komsomol in the Soviet Union. And obviously other totalitarian states had versions of this. The Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend is a famous example in Germany. I mean, I think any state that really does want to make radical change or transformation realizes that you have to start young.
And so for the older people, in the course, there's a shocking letter from Lenin saying we need to some regional commissars that you need to make an example of people, and I mean hang them up in public so that people can see and write me a response saying that you've done it. So sometimes those who held the older views or did not adapt to the new regime were simply killed or liquidated. Others were sent to forced labor camps, re-education camps. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is an example. How were these decisions made? Who needed to be killed by the new regime, by the communists? Who needed to be re-educated? What were the prospects for re-educating an older person? Could they convert someone used to the old regime into an adherent to the principles of communism?
Well, that's a very good question. In some ways, they didn't really try as hard as you might think to convert those older people, the class enemies, the ones with the benighted old views who might have been servants of the old regime, or perhaps bureaucrats under Tsarism, or perhaps merchants or landowners. They didn't really try very hard, to be honest. And in fact, some of them they were quite happy to allow to leave if they paid these kind of exit visa bribes and left the country. They obviously tried very hard to educate and indoctrinate the young. But as far as the rehabilitation aspect of forced labor, perhaps in some sense there was the idea that some of these people might eventually return and make some contribution to society. But the goal in most cases was a little bit more simple. It was both punishment, of course, and then also to have them labor. Whole sectors of the Soviet economy, things like gold mining, later uranium strip mining, public works projects, things like the White Sea Canal, things like the Moscow Metro. These were all built by slave laborers. So to some extent, the goal was quite simple. In fact, it was enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. Going back all the way to the revolution, they talked about this idea of a universal labor obligation. And that's actually right in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, quite remarkably. You know, the idea is that to some extent, even if you cannot transform their minds and turn them into good communists, you still have them serve the state. And by serving out their universal labor obligation, again, some of this might have been in forced labor camps or in certain specific public works projects. Some of it was a little more informal or haphazard. They would have these Saturday work brigades, the subotniks they called them, which was there they used this Orwellian language of calling it voluntary, except that, of course, it was not voluntary. And in fact, they quite openly bragged about how they were forcing everyone to work on Saturdays, but they were, I suppose, doing so voluntarily. But so the idea is the universal work obligation was the way that these people were being effectively employed, you might say, in order to build this future communist utopia. The re-education part, not so much in the early days. You began to see a bit more of that in the 60s and 70s, particularly under Brezhnev, when there was a bit more acceptance that perhaps not everyone will always be communist, so that you might unmask yourself, for example, by trying to leave the country if you tried to cross the border into Finland. There, the re-education, though, again, it wasn't as constructive as you might think. Usually you'd be sent to a psychiatric hospital, and effectively, you'd be given various treatments and injected with various psychotropic drugs until you kind of confessed your sins against communism, your imperfect understanding. Once you admitted that you were mentally ill, that you were not a believing communist, then they would lessen up on the treatment. And you know, if you became quite obedient and ready to serve, then they would release you back. So that was a kind of re-education.
George Orwell dramatizes that process in 1984, and one of the things that strikes you when you read it is how much time and effort that must take the government to cause Winston to love Big Brother, for example. O'Brien, his interrogator, has to spend hours and days and months with him, and you think, in practical terms, that would be actually quite difficult, the amount of resources the regime would have to expend on turning a resistor into a true believer.
And they did do that with some, but again, some of them they were quite happy simply to put to work to death, or in the case of the more famous Great Terror under Stalin, simply to beat them into confessing to their crimes and then, of course, just having them executed, which was in some ways a simpler way of dealing with the problem. Even though many of those people were actually believing communists who had fallen afoul somehow of the latest dictates, or seen by Stalin as potentially threatening, or seen by someone else who was trying to curry favor with Stalin as potentially threatening, and so they would be beaten sometimes in the famous halls of the Lubyanka, kind of torture chambers of the Czech of the NKVD, the later KGB, which changed its name many times, but the idea was the same, to torture people into confessing their crimes against the state. So again, they didn't always try rehabilitation, but it was tried from time to time, although usually, again, they worried more about indoctrinating the young into their belief in the system than, shall we say, re-educating those who were seen as almost beyond repair or irredeemable.
We've been talking about the domestic policies of communist regimes and the Soviets. In your provocatively titled Stalin's War, you turn to foreign policy, and you make the argument that Stalin was one of the chief instigators and beneficiaries of World War II. Why was Stalin interested in World War II, and what did he do to turn it to the Soviets' advantage?
Well, I think people have this mistaken idea of Stalin that because in some ways he seemed more chauvinistic or even perhaps nationalistic, or he built the Soviets into a great power and they won this war, that somehow he was more of a Russian nationalist than communist. However, we now know a lot more about Stalin's development, his early life, even his marginalian scribblings on various works, everything from his taste in movies to the kinds of things that he would write about or muse about. He was certainly in some ways a complicated figure who was capable of a kind of dark humor, cynicism about the world. But he was absolutely a communist, and an important part about his worldview, which dated back to Lenin and his own study, along with Lenin, of the history of the First World War, and Lenin's own writings during the First World War, and these are hardly secret. I mean, most of them are right there in the collected works of Lenin. Of course, we have most of their musings are quite well known because they were published, and so we understand how they thought about the world. So that when they looked at the First World War, for example, both before and then during it, and also after it, they saw this as part of this dialectical process, that although Marx had maybe initially prophesied that the revolution would happen after something that he called immiseration, that people would be proletarianized and eventually some ever tinier number of capitalist plutocrats would own everything and the workers would just kind of eventually rise up. Now, as the doctrine evolved on the fly before and during the First World War, the idea was that in fact the contradictions of capitalism would come out in the form of imperialistic rivalries, squabbling over markets, and eventually, of course, war. And this war would then help to destroy and weaken the various capitalist powers, and this would lead to the revolution. The communists would use the war as a kind of a springboard to power. In Lenin's phrase, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. And so the idea was that it wasn't just that war was this inherent part of the communist worldview, but that a specific type of war, imperialist war, war between these powers called either capitalist or imperialist, these wars were kind of inevitable. And the communists should in fact not try to stop them, rather they should try to promote them, however they could, because these were the wars that would eventually enable communists to triumph. Lenin was quite explicit about this. In a work called The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution, which followed up on his slightly more famous work on what he called imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. He said that this war would beget a class war, and eventually in one country after another, communists would come to power. But so long as capitalists were still in power elsewhere, they would inherently be in a state of war with the communists. In some ways, this idea is not entirely dissimilar to the Islamic idea that there is a house of war and a house of peace, the abode of peace and the abode of war. That in practice, there is always this kind of perhaps undeclared state of war between the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world. The war might be hot, it might be cold, it might break out at any time, but this inherent tension would always be there. And so the idea was that the Soviet Union, as both the birthplace and as the leading communist power, must be prepared for war at all times, but meanwhile must be prepared to exploit these wars. And so instead of talking about, in the way that I think these Western historians project onto Stalin their own views, that yes, that the Soviets could have been part of some collective security arrangement against Hitler if perhaps leaders in France and Britain had not been blinded by anti-communist prejudice. There are historians who continue asserting this, again, projecting their own understanding of the world onto Stalin. Stalin didn't talk about collective security. Stalin certainly wasn't talking about, let's say, how we can all work together against the Nazi threat to European civilization. Rather, Stalin thought that Hitler was part of the capitalist world and that eventually the various capitalist parties would go to war with one another, and that it was the interest of the Soviets to wait until their moment came during that war and then they would strike. This wasn't just some theory, it was something they actually talked about openly, and it's discussed in various texts, some of them theoretical, some of them speeches going back to the early 1920s. Again, based on their experience and understanding of what had happened in the First World War. You had two warring capitalist of so-called capitalist powers, and out of that war had emerged communism, the Soviet state. They didn't know precisely how it would happen. Stalin wasn't clairvoyant, he wasn't some Nostradamus. Rather, he saw this as in the interests of the Soviet Union. So that by signing the pact, what we usually call the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the aim was quite obvious. By almost encouraging Hitler to invade Poland, and the Soviets, of course, were going to invade Poland from the other side and divide Poland up. Stalin was hoping, again, he didn't know exactly what would happen, but he rather assumed it was likely that Britain, France, perhaps other countries would declare war on Germany. And if they did, then eventually there would be this devastating war between Nazi Germany and the Western powers, and the Soviets would be the beneficiary. Now, it didn't work out exactly as he planned. I mean, I shouldn't give the idea that, again, he was clairvoyant. He had this perfect strategic sense. In fact, he was quite surprised that Nazi Germany did so well in the early years of the war and did so well against their opponents that in the end it was kind of more of a rout than it was a war of attrition like the First World War, at least in the early stages up to 1941. In many ways, you can actually see Stalin's vision playing out even more to design, you might say, in Asia, where he signs this neutrality pact with Japan in April 1941. And this is a way of putting both his own Eastern Front, the Far Eastern Front, on ice so that he can focus on Europe. But it's also explicitly designed to encourage Japan to cross swords with the United States and Britain in Asia instead. That, of course, would be in the Soviet interest. And then Japan and the other capitalist powers would fight it out and kind of destroy each other and weaken each other, and then the Soviets would eventually make their moves. It's actually a quite coherent strategy, which fits in very well, again, with both the worldview of leading communists and even in their statements and declarations dating back to the 1920s. It makes a lot of sense from the point of view, again, of a communist strongman. And it actually worked out fairly well, again, in some ways better in Asia than it did in Europe, where the very success of the German Wehrmacht in the early years against Hitler's opponents nearly destroyed the strategy, and then Hitler ended up invading the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviets were still vulnerable and weren't really quite prepared for war, at least not prepared enough.
So Hitler's reversal and declaring war on the Soviets wasn't really that much of a reversal from Stalin's larger strategic view. If his goal was to have Germany and France and England and other capitalist parties fighting each other, it didn't really matter what side he was on as long as the capitalists were beating each other down.
Right.
How did Stalin fortify his position by keeping tabs on and influencing American policy?
Well, Stalin had, as we now know, of course, many agents working in the Treasury Department, in the State Department, along with a lot of other officials who might not have been, again, Soviet agents who reported regularly to handles, but simply sympathized with the Soviet Union. There was this kind of atmosphere in and around the White House and in and around the upper ranches of the Treasury Department, and particularly the State Department, that was broadly sympathetic to the Soviet Union. The Roosevelt administration had recognized the Soviets in 1933, which the previous three administrations had not done, in view of the Soviet default, effectively defaulting on all foreign loans and obligations, including those incurred by U.S. banks and the U.S. government, viewing the Soviets as an outlaw regime that had kind of violated their international obligations, and all these other reasons. Their devotion to world revolution and to toppling world governance. Various good reasons for not recognizing the Soviets. So dating all the way back to 1933, the Roosevelt administration had taken a much friendlier attitude towards the Soviets. This didn't mean there was any kind of alliance, quiet trade relations, At times, the Roosevelt administration even flirted with a tougher line. For example, after the Soviets invaded Finland in November 1939, there was a moral embargo that was declared so that certain types of dual-use or military exports to the Soviet Union were at least temporarily put on hold and abandoned. This policy was then quietly reversed in early 1941. What really is kind of remarkable if you trace the evolution of U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union is that even despite the friendlier attitude of the Roosevelt administration, the Soviets still had to spy in the 1930s. They had spies, for example, across the sphere of what I call the U.S. aerospace. I mean, back then it wasn't so much space. We're talking more about aviation companies and firms, certain universities, certain engineering departments, the predecessors of McDonnell Douglas, Douglas Aircraft, for example, Bell Aircraft. They had these kind of planter agents who had been burrowing their way into the U.S. defense establishment and trying to either kind of borrow or spy, or in some cases simply purchase patents. They did actually purchase sometimes for cash, quite openly and legally, patents for things like the suspension, the Christie suspension used in the famous T-34 tank, or certain types of military cargo aircraft. So that the Soviets had to, that is, both spend the money and also spend the effort trying to either purchase aviation technology secrets or, in some cases, of course, pry them out, spying them out. After 1941, it was quite remarkable. They didn't have to do this. They simply ordered everything. They simply procured it, and they didn't really have to pay for it because of Lend-Lease, or that is, they were expected to pay for it at some day in the infinite future, perhaps after the war. They simply placed orders, and even some of the people who used to be spies now became purchasing agents. It's really quite a remarkable transformation. It didn't really get going, of course, till after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and so then the idea was, well, the defense of the Soviet Union, or the survival in the first case of the Soviet Union against the Nazi threat, meant that all of the interests of the Soviet Union, particularly in the military sphere, were now, according to Roosevelt's interpretation of the Lend-Lease Act, U.S. priorities as well. And so they were given the same requisition forms used by the U.S. Army. And in fact, in many cases, they're actually given priority. The most famous I talk about in Stalin's war is effectively it took over Newark Airport during the war. They took over Fairbanks, Alaska. I mean, almost the whole town, really, because Stalin didn't trust that U.S. pilots could fly him the warplanes that he was receiving by way of the Alaska route, who were being flown into the Far East. He didn't want U.S. pilots to land on Soviet territory. And in fact, he thought even Nome was too close to Soviet territory. And so the Soviet pilots took delivery in Fairbanks. That was the arrangement. So it wasn't just about helping the Soviets, it was even about prioritizing them. In fact, this, again, there's nothing secret about this. Even after Pearl Harbor, when Hitler, among many other people, assumed, and this is part of the reason he made the foolish decision to declare war on the United States, that the U.S. would plunge into this Pacific War against Japan, and that's where the U.S. priority would be. Roosevelt made clear in the joint Arcadia declarations with Britain, with Churchill in December 1941, that it wasn't simply that Germany was the U.S. the first priority, but the first priority above all other priorities in the war was, in fact, assistance to Russia's offensive by all available means. So we talk about Soviet influence, but honestly, I mean, this wasn't even about influence operations. I mean, in some subtle way, maybe, but this was actually Roosevelt's own decision. And again, maybe from the American perspective, or perhaps the way Roosevelt was justifying it to himself, letting the Soviets do the fighting and giving them the equipment and the foodstuffs and the material and the inputs that they needed for their own war factories and the tanks and the trucks, the Studebakers and so on and so forth. Well, better that the Russians bleed and die than Americans. I think this is probably the way Roosevelt justified it. But it sure did work out very well from Stalin's perspective.
Is the Cold War a direct result of these policies? Is propping up the Soviet regime, aiding them and helping them sustain their combat operations, did that result in the Cold War that followed?
Well, I think it resulted in the sense that it helped the Soviet armies both to survive and then eventually triumph and, of course, impose their will on Eastern Europe and enlarge the Soviet Empire, which turned the Soviets into, you might say, a peer competitor, as we used to call it, a superpower. There were other aspects to this. In addition to all of the Lend-Lease aid the United States sent the Soviets up until 1945, although, of course, they did finally, well, they stopped the European aid after VE Day. The aid to the Soviets in the Far East continued right on through the summer of 1945, right up to the end of the war. In addition to this, the Soviets also conducted these massive-scale looting operations, industrial looting operations in occupied Germany and Poland and Hungary, all the other countries they occupied. So there were other ways in which the Soviets turned into a kind of a peer competitor. So I guess the way I would answer your question is I think some type of confrontation was perhaps inevitable. The reason the Cold War, I think, took on the shape that it did, that the Soviets were able to actually, in some ways, punch above their economic weight as a quasi-peer competitor of the United States. Some of this, of course, was also because of spying. Manhattan Project, as we know, the Soviets had spies there, and so they were able to get a kind of head start in their own atomic bomb program. There was a lot of technology they had acquired from the United States during the war, technology and various patents they acquired from Germany after the war, just quite literally by shipping this stuff and many of the documents back to Russia. I think this allowed Stalin and the Soviets, again, to become a peer competitor, a real threat to the United States. That is to say, there might have been some type of a strategic confrontation or conflict, but I think it was in part because of the Lend-Lease aid that the Soviets were able to become as powerful as they were. That is, a genuine peer competitor to the United States.
Then in the remaining time we have, let's turn to your newest book. We've just been talking about the rise of communism, but of course it fell, at least in terms of the Soviet regime and many of its satellite states. And it fell after decades of human misery, tens of millions of deaths, either from starvation or directly killed by their governments, a legacy of failure and horror and misery. And yet, you say the rise and fall and rise of communism. What is happening today with communism? Is it rising again?
Well, I think like many of us who were alive for the dramatic events of the late 1980s and early 90s, when we saw eventually the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, people now recall, perhaps with a bit of irony, the Francis Fukuyama thesis about the alleged end of history and so on. And we have maybe an image in our mind. We have Reagan with some of his speeches, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's quite amazing. 1987, 2 years later, the wall actually is torn down. Or we might remember Yeltsin bellowing on the tank and staring down this, what he called an anti-democratic, anti-constitutional coup d'etat staged by these elements of the old Communist Party and Russian state. We maybe have this idea in our mind that, well, thank goodness that all that is over and it's behind us, and thank goodness that the Russian people rose up and threw off their oppressors and so on and so forth. Well, even in the case of Russia, there's a lot more that we know now that perhaps we didn't know then. Even when it comes to some of the Gorbachev reforms, such as perestroika. Back then, Gorbachev became, oddly enough, even more admired in the West than he was in Russia. In fact, in Russia, he's largely despised. His legacy is seen as someone who just brought about the decline and fall, really, of the Soviet Empire. But in the West, I think he was both revered and admired. He was seen as this peace-minded leader. For whatever reason, people credit him more than Reagan in some of the arms control agreements, even though it was mostly Reagan putting the pressure on Gorbachev. People forget a lot of things. They forget the Soviets were, of course, still fighting a brutal war in Afghanistan right up until 1988. They forget that the Soviets shed blood many times, on many occasions, suppressing protesters, demonstrators, right up to really the end of the 1980s. They forget that the point or the purpose of perestroika was not to liberate the Russian people, but to counter Reagan's arm buildup and the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, that the Soviets, in fact, did conduct a massive arms buildup in the late 1980s. By 1988 and 89, that actually achieved a massive preponderance in production of all variety of armor, of everything from tanks to artillery. Even in certain range ballistic missiles. We know today Russia still has, of course, very strong and powerful biological warfare. Even things as basic as kind of just measures of the production of small arms. The Soviets were engaging in a massive arms buildup. And in fact, in this sense, if not in others, perestroika actually succeeded. Now, we know it didn't succeed in the consumer sector. We know that in many ways the Soviet economy was very weak. We know that the Soviets were suffering inflationary pressures by 1989. Gorbachev eventually had to come begging effectively for loans, for money from the West. And the Cold War did end very decisively in this sense. It's quite remarkable that you actually had Gorbachev in the end haggling over things like, we will withdraw our troops from Germany so long as the Germans help to pay for the new apartments back in Moscow. Soviet generals were accusing Gorbachev, this is according to Gorbachev himself incidentally, and we actually have the transcript, that he was selling off the Soviet Empire for Deutschmarks, or later on that he effectively offered to surrender in the Cold War for dollars. He was begging President Bush. He said, you spend all this money on the Gulf War. Why can't you spend a similar sum, for example, helping to bail me out from my problems in the Soviet Union? And Bush was so embarrassed by this request that he turned crimson red. It was quite a remarkable fall from 1985, when at the first summit, Gorbachev in Geneva, with Reagan in Geneva, Gorbachev is talking about SDI, and he's saying, we will build up to smash your shield. And 4 or 5 years later, again, he's begging for loans and he's begging for help. What some people forget about all of this is that despite Gorbachev's, I think, incompetence, in many ways he was simply incompetent, and that's part of the reason Russians revile him today. Again, the Soviets had succeeded in this arms buildup. Yes, they were suffering casualties in Afghanistan, the US, of course, aiding the Mujahideen there. In many ways, that did harm the prestige of the Soviet military. But it was still Gorbachev who crossed swords with his own officers. He would order them to suppress demonstrations in places like Kazakhstan or in Georgia. And then he would disown them and rebuke them publicly. When there was a crackdown a little closer to Europe that got more attention in Lithuania and in Latvia, so now we're moving into 1990 and early 1991, he actually publicly, again, repudiated and rebuked the officers who had actually carried out basically his own orders. And in the end, the military didn't stand with him. And so in a very different sense, but perhaps a more literal sense, the so-called August coup of 1991, a coup carried out by Gorbachev's own appointees, something like 18 of the 20 men effectively the version of the Politburo who were involved in this coup were his own appointees. Gorbachev himself had originally been effectively ushered into power by the KGB. There's a lot we still don't know about this coup, but the part that we do know is that in the end, enough elements of the military turned on whether it was Gorbachev again or Gorbachev's appointees in the government. It's a little bit vague, but that is, they refused to fight for that government. It was effectively a kind of a mutiny. What I say in the book is that to some extent this was a little bit like what had happened in 1917 with the Kornilov affair, that Kerensky fatally had undermined confidence and lost the faith or the loyalty in a critical number of officers in what was then, of course, the Russian Imperial Army, who then refused to fight for him when the Bolsheviks took power, which mattered, of course, because they didn't have that many men under arms either in Petrograd, but they had just enough to make it count. Gorbachev forfeited the rights of the army. And there was an initial moment of euphoria, and Yeltsin actually tried to ban the Communist Party, and there was a lot of talk of a reckoning that we'll finally know the truth about the crimes of communism in Russia. Some people know that there was actually a trial in 1992 involving the Russian Communist Party. I think some people, though, have the mistaken idea that the Russian Communist Party was put on trial, a bit like many of the leading Nazis at Nuremberg for their crimes. In fact, that's not what happened. In fact, the Communist Party sued to be reinstated as a legal political party in Russia, and the Communist Party won. They won their lawsuit, and that's why they did become a legal party in Russia, and they contested and nearly won the 1996 presidential elections, and they're still, depending again on the year, either the second or in some cases almost the largest political party in Russia, even though Putin is usually able to neutralize them or keep them under control. They, of course, still operate under Russian law as a perfectly legal entity, claiming that, in fact, the idea that we were some kind of organized criminal conspiracy was wrong. We're just a political party like all the others. China is a more obvious example where we should have known as early as June 1989, with the Tiananmen Square massacre, that the communists were still in power. They were still in the saddle there, and they were still willing to deploy the type of directed political violence that in the end Gorbachev shied away from. Again, not that he was squeamish in all cases about bloodshed. He did order many crackdowns, but in the end he did decline or refuse for whatever reason. Maybe it was because he enjoyed all the press adulation he was getting in the West, being invited to Western universities, being showered with praise and accolades, and being called Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He wasn't universally acclaimed. A story I used to know in the years I lived in Turkey was that when he went to speak at Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara, they actually pelted him with vegetables and tomatoes because these were Marxists who saw him as a sellout. But Gorbachev, again, for whatever reason, vanity or a desire to be thought well of by his admirers in the West, in the end he shied away from the type of serious crackdown that perhaps he could have deployed to keep the empire together in Eastern Europe, or at the very least, in a kind of operation of triage in the Soviet Union.
What about the idea of communism in the Western mind? Occupy Wall Street, Antifa, other movements that claim some of the principles of communism here in America and in other Western countries. Do those have strength? Do they have endurance? What's their influence like in the West today?
Well, there are certainly many movements there that are either inspired or perhaps associated with, or you might say adjacent to either Marxism or communism. Until recently, the label itself would, of course, be abjured or would be denied because communism used to be almost a taboo word in American politics. Now, it's true that anti-communism, too, was always seen as this extreme movement associated with McCarthy and McCarthyism. But at the very least, even though many liberals said, oh, well, the anti-communists went too far and violated civil liberties, they, too, at least had come to agree during the Cold War years, and it was a bipartisan consensus in Washington, certainly, that even many liberals said, well, look, we are liberals, we're not communists. I think that taboo has begun to fade, in part simply because many people no longer have a living memory of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire. They know that China is nominally communist. They know that Vietnam is nominally communist, as is Laos. They know that Castro continued to toddle on in Cuba, and later Raul Castro, his brother. They know that, perhaps they don't know, that Cambodia is actually still largely ruled by the Communist Party, even though they actually did bring back the monarchy in the early 1990s. They know these things, but they think they're not really relevant. That China seems more like a state capitalist or hybrid capitalist type of country than a communist one, even though the communists are still in power there. So I don't know if anyone endorses communism. Well, some people do. It's a minority who would actually openly say, yes, we are advocating endorsing communism in the West. But certain ideas, which were, I think, particular or even important to the faith or even the doctrine, even sometimes the political program of the communists, even going back to, of course, progressive taxation and certain elements of state intervention or control in the economy, or price controls, which people talk about. Obviously, there are elements of the communist playbook that people might piecemeal select one or the other. I think in some ways, though, the danger, or at least the more serious prospect many of us has to face. I don't think anyone in the West is going to bring back, let's say, the Soviet Gosplan or Komikon, this full-on state planning model for trying to pretend to control the entire economy and plan the production of every possible industrial and manufacturing good and widget, and full-on state control of agriculture and the abolition of private property. I think even in China, the party has realized that that version of communism doesn't work very well and is frankly impractical. No matter how hard you try, there will always be a black market. You simply need these things to survive. Rather, the elements of communism that seem to work are the elements of coercion. The social credit system we were talking about earlier, elements of surveillance, of keeping people in line, making sure that people don't become any type of an active threat to the powers that be, in the case of the United States, to the large corporations, in addition to the government. Of course, there's a lot of interaction between them. That is, the variety that we have to deal with now, in some ways, I think, is perhaps less overt than the communist idea of abolishing private property and confiscating everyone's goods and nationalizing all private firms. I don't think that's the type of thing that a lot of people are advocating practically. But the statist aspects of communism, again, many of which are not new at all. You can go back to the writings of Marx and his earliest critics. Bakunin is this example, this Russian anarchist who crossed swords with Marx over the Paris Commune, over Marx's domineering and authoritarian rule of what was then called the First Working Man's International Association. He intuited right away what this meant. Look, to plan the economy, or to do any of these things that you say will entail communism, you're going to have an all-powerful state, or what he called statism. And this state is going to employ some variety of all-seeing bureaucrats, intellectuals, some variety of Plato's would-be philosopher kings who've been anointed, the party leaders, the planners. Maybe in the United States we talk about the administrative state, and they are going to oversee everyone else, and they are going to try to tell everyone what they can do and what they can say. And I think it's that aspect of communism, the subtler aspect, but the aspect involving surveillance and censorship. I think that's what we're seeing a lot more of in the West today. Certainly we saw it in China. I mean, we imported many of these controls quite directly from China during the COVID period. Everything from forcible quarantines to restrictions on travel and movement, and of course even employment. In some cases specifically related to the vaccines, and other cases related to what people were allowed to say on YouTube or on X, which was then still called Twitter, social media communications, that there was this crackdown on certain varieties of speech that were seen as threatening to, it wasn't always just the government, again, it might have been to the profit margins of Pfizer or various powerful corporations and their sweetheart deals with various Western governments. What was kind of amazing about that period, there's this quote which I cite in the book of Neil Ferguson. I should specify this is not Neil Ferguson, the Scottish-British historian of the Hoover Institution, who's a very different Neil Ferguson, and I don't want to associate any smears with his name. And I'm talking about the alleged epidemiologist Neil Ferguson, whose models for, again, these kind of inflated COVID death counts were used to justify these extreme coercive measures back in 2020, 2021, right on to 2022 in many cases. He actually said, at first we didn't think we could do it. We think these were things they did in communist China. And we tried it out in Italy and we realized we could. And then they did. And we're all, to some extent, still living with the aftermath of the consequences. Some of us still living in shock over what happened in this country, to so many countries in the West, most of which, fortunately, has now been abandoned. But the example is still there, this example of the state effectively trying to coerce, control, lock people in their homes, tell people where they're allowed to go, what they're allowed to do, what businesses they're allowed to operate. That was probably the closest many of us will have gotten to a more coercive version of statism or communism, again, whatever one wants to call that. And we hope that we don't have to endure that sort of thing again.
Well, thank you for the work that you are doing to educate Americans and people all over the world about the history of communism and helping us think about the ways that some of these principles and practices might be at play today. Students and viewers, thank you for joining us today. To view our course on communism, go to hillsdale.edu/Marxism or click the link in the description. Also in the description will be links to Professor McMeekin's books. Professor McMeekin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jeremiah. It was a great pleasure.